as you know, our press is committed to bringing forward Orthodox and Catholic and other creedal Christian authors. So one of the things that we're doing is having webinars that we're sponsoring and bringing you experts in their field. Tonight's expert is one of my favorites. I was a fan before I was a friend and before I knew her professionally, Mary Virginia Munoz, who also writes as Virginia Carmichael and Mary Jane Hathaway. Now, there's a lot you could read about Mary Virginia Munoz online, but I want to tell you a little bit about how I first came to know her. I am a fan of Jane Austen. And so I started reading her Austen Takes the South series when it first came out. And then about, I don't know how many months later, it was picked up by Simon & Schuster. And then I think I bought both versions of the book. And I've read her, almost all of her clean romance novels. And I have purchased, but I don't know if I finished reading her cozy mysteries. However, I have not read everything because Mary is the author of over 50 books. She writes in the genres of Christian fiction, historical fiction, sweet romance with Christian characters, including the Cane River Romance series, which has Catholic characters set down in, I'm not going to say it right, Louisiana. I don't remember, it's Natchez. Is that how you say it? In Texas, it looks like Nacogdoches. How do you say it?
Natchitoches.
Natchitoches. See, it's one of those words that shows up down here in the Bayou country where I feel embarrassed because I'm on the other end of the Bayou country from there. But we all pronounce it differently. We have almost the same word and we all say it different. So that was one of my favorite series. And I've sort of kept that in my heart and seeing Mary as an example of a very prolific Catholic author who manages to make faith something so normal in her stories, so approachable that that even Orthodox characters are in some of her books. She was part of a book series recently set in another small town, and she even had Orthodox characters, which you almost never see in fiction. So I want to welcome her and tell you a little bit about one more thing I want to tell you. So like a lot of us, Mary is a parent. She has 6 children with her husband. Is it Chris or Cruz?
His name is Cruzberto, but we call him Cruz.
Yes,
yeah, because
Cruz.
Even I can't say his name right, so don't feel bad.
Cruzberto, right. And they have 6 children, and some of them are older now and in college, I think.
Right. 3 of them in
I want to give that background because when we're talking about writing deadlines, a lot of us, whether we're parents or we're just busy in the world or doing a lot of volunteer work or, just working hard at our jobs, it's really hard to find time to write. So here's someone who has written lots of books, all while being a very busy parent. And I just want to say welcome. So welcome, Mary. And we're very excited to hear from you tonight. Hope everybody will, if you're not in, go ahead and tune in. And I'm going to mute myself so I can listen.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I just want to say something really quick about the series that had the Orthodox characters. Summer was really, really helpful because I wanted to approach those characters through the eyes of someone who wasn't familiar with the Orthodox religion. And so the main male lead was Orthodox, and he had this large extended family. And then the female lead was not familiar at all with Orthodoxy. And so that was a really fun experience to try to bring in that character in a way that was warm and welcoming and it also informative because if you've ever been to an Orthodox service as someone who's never been to one before, it is a little bit different. And so I just want to thank Summer again for all the help on that series. So today what we're talking about is 5 tips for making a deadline. And I think these steps can be really helpful for anybody, even if you have young kids or older kids or no kids. Some people struggle even when their husband goes to work every day and their kids are at school every day and they have the whole house to themselves and they still struggle. So I think these steps can really help people get to the meat of the writing a lot faster. And so you can actually get a full book form. And there are a couple quotes I have above my desk Some are more inspiring than others, but one of them is you can't sell a book that's not finished. And you can change that to you can't read a book that's not finished. When you think of all the books you've read in everything on your shelf, all those books had to be finished before they could be polished and published and brought to you. So people worry a lot about different things when they're writing, but I think when beginner writers come up to me and say, they're writing and they're having trouble with their book, I always ask them, so how far are you? And a lot of times the answer is, oh, a chapter or 2 chapters. How long have you been working on it? Oh, about 6 months or a year or 5 years. So the first thing I usually tell people is, I ask them, how big do you want your book to be? What are you imagining this book to be? Is it a 150-page novella, or is it a 300 to 400 page, part of a series? Is it 700 pages? Where do you see the book going? Usually people underestimate. They say, well, 200 pages, and it ends up much more once they get into it. But I usually ask them, how big the book is going to be. And 1,000 words is about 5 pages. So if it's one of those things where someone's just talking to me really briefly, I always tell them it's a numbers game. And your 1,000 words a day gets you about 5 pages. So if you're trying to get a 60,000 word book, which is about 240 pages, you have to do at least 1,000 words a day to make it in 2 months. Well, what if you don't want to write a book in 2 months? You want to write a book in 6 months. Well, then you can do the math and maybe 500 words a day. Some days are better than other. Maybe some days you get the 1,000 words. Some days you only get 250. But you've got to have a running tally, because if you do 7 days of 250 words and you're trying to write a book in 2 months, you got some catch up to do. So I think as parents, it's really important to schedule, what you're doing. I try not to write on Sundays. And also, with kids, you see things coming from a distance. You see like, oh, there's this baseball game, or there's this trip we're taking. So you have to figure out where you are in order to get the work done, and you don't run up on your deadline realizing you still have, 17,000 words left to do. So, I would say number one is it's a numbers game. And you really got to know where you're going and how much you can write a night. My first book, which is right here it is, this one, yay, actually took me 2 years to write, because I had fallen into the trap of, I think I have like 6 different beginnings for that book. There was one that actually won an all-around award. I can't remember the contest. I was really excited about it, and that didn't even make it into the book. It's a completely different scene. Starts at not a writers conference, starts at a conference, historians conference. I thought it was great, but the beta readers that I gave it to were like, this was weird. I didn't understand what the conflict was. I didn't understand who the characters were, so scrap that. I also took, I think, 6 months on the first chapter. It's terrible to admit that. It's really embarrassing. But you don't realize you're doing it until you're doing it. So it's important to have that graph and to keep track of things if you're really serious about your deadline. You're like, hey, I want to finish this book. Especially now that we're getting into NaNoWriMo. If anybody's doing that this month, which I've never done it, I have to be motivated by more than like a little badge. I've got to have somebody like telling me this is the date. But so yeah, this one took 2 years, and the next book, this one took 2 months. It is smaller, but the that was actually, I won a contest through Seekerville that you would submit your book to an editor if you won the contest. Well, I didn't have a book. What I was trying for was the chocolate, which was third prize. I wanted the chocolate And so I submitted a first chapter, hoping I would win the chocolate because I didn't have the book. And unfortunately, what I won was the prize of submitting the book to a publisher. Well, I didn't have one. So I wrote as fast as possible and I turned it in, and I completely surprised myself that I could possibly write a book in 2 months. But, fear is a great motivator because I didn't want to blow that chance.
I just wanted to jump in here and say that is one of the best stories I've ever heard, that you're trying to work for chocolate. We'll write for chocolate. That should be your second point. And also, but I also had one question, because I don't know, I forgot to say this at the beginning. You have a background in academics. You have a religious studies degree and a theoretical linguistics degree, and you've studied abroad. Did all of that background in research help you to write faster?
I think it did. I think it helps me come to the writing process in an analytical way, because we all know that writers kind of live up here, and we live in stories. I mean, there'll be a little bit of music and you'll see, I have writer friends and they'll be like, I heard this series of notes and suddenly I thought of a story. I mean, that's kind of what we are. We're so attuned to the creative side of it that it's really helpful to have worked for years and years and years with deadlines, and especially writing deadlines. So if you get into, I went to grad school at the Warsaw School of Economics, and we had 25 to 30 page papers that were due every couple months. And you can't really wait until the last minute. And you can't, be creative about it. You've got to be analytical about it. So yeah, I think that does help. Definitely. Yeah. It didn't help with the first book, but it definitely helped with the second one. All right. So the next point, actually, I think I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about, I think realizing what kind of writer you are is really helpful before you begin. And if people know that they don't want to sit at a desk for 5 or 6 hours or 7 hours, you have to know that going in, because people will schedule. I know people who spend Friday to Sunday evening at their desk, and they'll get these 10,000 word days. That's not me. I can't do it. I get bored with myself. I get bored with the room. There's not enough music to distract me, and eventually I'm wandering around. So for me, it's really helpful to know that I'm not a person that can make up in a weekend that kind of word count. So I like to ask people, where do you write? What's comfortable for you? A lot of people write on their couch. I couldn't do that. I would just look around and see, oh, I need to clean that and clean that. And pretty soon I'm talking to people, so that doesn't work. Are you somebody who works with silence? Are you somebody who works with music? Do you like to be in a crowded coffee shop? And a lot of that takes, a little bit of investigating, taking your laptop to different places. And do I feel better at the park in the sunshine, or do I feel better, late at night in my room? That was me. I would work from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. And just because it was quiet, I can't really have any distractions, even if they're not my kids at the park. I'm still watching people's children or their dog or something. So I really have to have complete silence, my little desk, a little bit of light, just make a cocoon out of it. And that was really helpful, finally understanding that writing a book standing at a desk at work, or because I used to work at a library, wasn't the easiest way. Yeah. So anyway, we'll move on to point 2, which is talking about, there's a lot that people talk about, pantsers or plotters. If you write by the seat of your pants, or if you plot your book all the way through. So, and a lot of people fight over it. And they say, oh, pantsers are completely scattered and their books turn out crazy, or plotters are dry and boring. And, it's not really an either or. I think we all have a little bit of those two things. For me, I'm what I call a reverse plotter. So I'll write the chapter, and then as soon as I'm done with the chapter, I'll go back and I'll take a piece of paper and I'll write out in shorthand what happened. So I'll have, chapter 1, intro these characters, this was the setting, this was the conflict. this was the hook. And then I'll write chapter 2, and then I'll go back. And that really helps when I get to the saggy middle, which I'll get to like chapter 8, 9, or 10, and suddenly things are slow. I don't know how to get to the point. Where I look back at my reverse plotting, I see the steps, and probably I've missed something. If I keep looking through it, I usually see, oh, okay, I actually did too many of these scenes and not enough of these scenes. And then I can fix whatever's happening. So, yeah, definitely understanding your writing style can help speed things along. And it sounds like a lot to take in, and it sounds like, oh, you're not going to know this till your third or fourth book. But I think a lot of writers already know the kind of writer they are. There are people who I have a friend who scribbles down scenes on receipts as she's standing in line. I could never do that. But she's standing in line, she might as well, and she'll have this idea, and it's a great idea, and she'll write it down. She always keeps a little notepad with her. And then later on, she'll incorporate these really powerful scenes into her novel. Well, where did she get it? Yeah, she was at Albertsons in line buying her groceries, and it's just wild to me that she's able to write that kind of thing down in a coherent note and then use it later. So I think pantsing and plotting is not as cut and dry as people think it is. It's really helpful to know where you are on that spectrum. So let's see. Number 3 is, I hear somebody open a door back there, is writing with kids. Oh, this is going to be a fun one. So when I first started writing, I was pregnant with my 5th child, and then I had my 6th one about a year later. And I wrote my first book during nap times, where I was sitting on, it was actually a broken toy box. That was the only thing that was low enough for my desk. I was sitting on a broken toy box nursing my baby until he fell asleep. And then I would hold him in one hand and peck out the book with the other hand. That was about like the only time I actually had to get anything down on a screen. And so that was really, it was really helpful to be able to utilize that time. Just a second, I'm just going to mute myself for one moment. That worked out well. The perfect time. Anyway, so you can look at what you have around your house. Like if you have a lot of really young kids, this isn't going to help for you to do all of your writing and everything while your children are awake or in the room, unless you're able to deal with all those distractions. If you can deal with those distractions, then I think that go ahead and go for it. But a lot of people can't. I couldn't. So I had to find a time where things were very quiet. The other issue with having kids at home is the amount of tasks and chores that you have. So sometimes you have to let things go. And people could always tell when I was on a deadline, because my house is a little bit crazy looking, because I wasn't going to spend the extra hour and a half, wiping down trim or cleaning or, sorting toys or making beds or whatever. I wasn't going to do that because I was on a deadline. I was going to use whatever time that I had where things were quiet. So unfortunately, sometimes you do have to not have the perfect home. Maybe you're not going to have the perfect meal with all the fruits and vegetables and everything in it. Sometimes it's cereal, and that's really okay. That's something I had to come to terms with. I felt bad, like, okay, here we are having sandwiches. That's okay, because it's one day out of the week. Nobody's going to die. Everybody's still getting fed. Peanut butter is very nutritious. It's going to be okay. So a lot of people try to do everything, and they feel like I have to keep the perfect house, and I have to have the perfect meals, and I have to hit all of, like, sometimes I would ask friends to, take my kids to the, say, the baseball, uh, you know, whatever, not the baseball game, but the practices, or I'd ask them to take them to the Cub Scout meeting. So that saved me from having to get up and come back and forth and that kind of thing. Or even like a camping trip, like a Cub Scout camping trip that normally if I wasn't on a deadline, I would go to, but on a deadline, that I'm like, I'm sorry, this is the focus right now. And you just got to put a little, I mean, everybody's got that mom guilt, but it's not like you're never going to go on a camping trip. It's one camping trip. Um, so it helps to kind of give yourself a pass, you know?
I have a question for you because I don't think everyone knows this. You're actually a hybrid author. You have published with Harlequin, with Simon and Schuster, and I think some others. And as you're also your own independent publisher. So do you find that balancing family life is different whenever you're writing for someone else versus your own self-imposed deadline?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because with the traditional publishers, they would say, we need the book submitted by this date. So you submit it, and then you wait and see what the notes are and what the changes are. Because if they come, which they will come back with first their line edits, which are fairly simple. And of course, almost always, yeah. Well, except with the Southern books, it gets a little iffy. Sometimes the line editors have no idea what they're doing, and they're like, nobody talks like this. Oh yeah, they do actually. But so if you have the line editing isn't usually a problem, but if there's a content issue, the editor wants you to move around, you've got kind of an extended deadline. You're kind of like, things could go smoothly, but you don't know. It's usually 3 to 4 weeks afterward. And then they'll say, could you turn it in 2 weeks from now? So then you suddenly have another deadline. So you submit the book, but then you're still not done with it. And with the indie publishing or the self-publishing, the editing part is before the publishing, obviously. So I can give the book to the editor. They have their own timeline. They send it back to me. I can make changes, and then, and then I've got it up. So, and we usually hash that out. So if we want something to be published November 20th, then we want to make sure that all of those possible changes and back and forths are all done, like way before then. So yeah, it is a little bit different. A little less communication probably with the traditional side. Yeah. Okay, so another thing with writing with kids, I think there are things that that always make your life a little bit easier. And so for a long time, I used to set my books to come due in the spring or the summer because kids are outside more. We have a big backyard. And so people could be out playing. I could keep an eye on them. I could still be working. It's really hard for me to have a book due in the wintertime because it's dark at 4:30. Everybody's inside the house. They also like to stay up later, even though it's dark earlier. You've got the Christmas lights, and it's exciting season, and they're also the holidays. Like I don't like to have a deadline in the Advent season, the Lenten season. So I try to look at the church calendar because there are all these other services too. So a Thursday isn't really a Thursday if you're talking about Lent, or a Friday isn't always a Friday. You've got other services happening and other traditions. And so I try to kind of work around that, which is difficult to explain to a secular publisher, which is another reason I like self-publishing, because, my schedule is my schedule and I have a reason for it. But when they ask you, hey, can you turn this in, March 20th, I was like, it's in the middle of Lent, but anyway, so sometimes I also I've had my sister come and take the kids for a weekend or something. I know that's not always what everybody can do, but sometimes when you're at the you're at the very end, and if you have anybody who can help out or give you a weekend of free time, that can be really helpful. She's saved my bacon a couple times by oh, let's go on a camping trip. And then I really can just try to plow through, the last of the overview and rereading and printing out and that kind of stuff. Okay. Number 4 is there are two different things. Another quote that I have on my desk is it's from Shannon Hale, and she talks about you can't edit a book that's not written, and you can't finish a book. You can't read a book that's not written. But what she talks about is putting sand in your sandbox. Your writing a book is your sandcastle, and you can't make the sandcastle unless you've got some sand. So what the writer's life is, you're always handed that empty sandbox, and what your sand is all your words, and you can't make anything unless there's something on the page. So when I get tired and I'm like, I really don't want to work on this anymore, I think about that even if the last 2 or 3 pages aren't useful in particular, there still might be something in there. There still might be something I can save. Sometimes when I'm just writing to myself, I'll come up with something. Sometimes I'll even talk about how tired I am, like skip a little space, and then I'll talk about, wow, I'm really tired. I don't want to finish this book. And then I, let out a little of that aggravation, erase it, keep going. But putting the sand in the sandbox is so important because, as an editor, Summer, how this works, that you can't be reading through a scene and then somebody puts exciting things happen. It's got to be, something's got to be there to work with. And unless we try to get it down on paper, a lot of people they struggle with the internal editor. Editors are great. I love editors, but the internal editor, not so awesome. The internal editor is the one, as you're writing, that tells you you don't have any reason to write this book. No one's going to read it. You don't know what you're doing. You didn't major in literature. This is a silly scene. So it helps to give yourself a little pep talk, like sometimes even like I've done it. I've just pretended like my cozy mystery series I wrote for myself, just because I thought it would be fun for me, because I was kind of tired of romance and I thought, I really want to write something where people die. So I wrote, these 3 or 4 books and just wrote them for myself because I wanted to write about different kinds of characters. And I didn't want to have the pressure of, here's the happy ending. I wanted to be able to leave it with a promise or, maybe a hint that something else is coming, rather than here's your proposal scene and here's your marriage and, the rest. And it was really nice to break out of that little prison of romance writing. So, but in order to do that, I had to actually just talk to myself and say, nobody's ever going to read it. Nobody's ever going to read it. And the more I told myself that, the faster I could write, and the more comfortable I felt putting all of these words down that weren't in the genre that I usually work with. So I think part of also breaking down the internal editor is getting in the zone. And we kind of touched on that when we talked about knowing what kind of writer you are. But some people can just sit down. They say between 9 and 10, I'm going to write 1,000 words. And they'll put themselves in the chair at 9 o'clock and just start writing. 10 o'clock comes and they've got 1,000 words or 1,500 words. That's not the kind of writer I am. I need some transition time. Sometimes the transition is a little tidying or cleaning, just so I feel a little bit like I've done something, or going out, taking a long walk, getting some energy out. And then when I sit down, I still have a little bit of transition time, maybe 15, 20 minutes, where, just make sure my desk is clean, think about what I'm doing. I might read something. And just to be able to get into the mindset that now I'm going to write. But I have to make sure, as scattered as I am, I like to, I should check this, and I'm going to look over here, I should open. No. I have to really tell myself, once you start writing, you can leave a note to yourself, but don't leave what you're working on, because it's really too easy to stand up and go make a phone call, or, I forgot to do this, it needs to be done right now. Just, if it can wait, if your kids aren't knocking on the door, let me back in. If it can wait, go ahead and finish that hour. And then sometimes it takes a little bit to come back out of that too. So if you're talking about writing from 9 to 10 or 9 to 11, I like to leave myself a little bit of a cushion. If I have something right to do at 11, I'll stop a little bit early, because otherwise I feel like I'm just rushing from this world that we live in as we're writing to, um, you know, reality. That can be kind of a shock. I'm sure all the writers out there know what I'm talking about. It can be very, painful when somebody pulls you out of that, especially repeatedly. So I think that was number 4.
Before you move to number 5, I wanted to ask you something. I wanted to tell you, so just to share something. I love how you mentioned the staying on task. One thing that helps me is I like to have either a notebook or my phone, but turned off, like everything turned off except for my text messaging. Have that next to me when I'm actually writing, so that I can text myself a note if I remember something random, or I could write it on my calendar. It's just giving yourself the infrastructure to be able to write is really helpful. And I really like that. And I love that you're addressing this internal editor. One thing I wanted to ask you on that point with putting sand in your sandbox, do you think that also, do you also mean by that sort of feeding your spirit in some way, or is it mostly just giving yourself time, or is it also things like the music that you mentioned before and the walks? Is like, what would you say is part of the feeding into the putting sand in your sandbox?
I would put all of that in there. Everything that is going to help you be a better writer. So it might not be the sand in the sandbox, but it could even be the sandbox itself. Like, I could not put sand in the sandbox without, the spiritual component. I couldn't, I wouldn't have any reason to write, really. That is the sandbox kind of. And also anything that helps me put that in there is maybe like another slat, another side. That's definitely part of it. That it's really difficult, especially when you're not in the right frame of mind, and you're struggling with other things, to try to sit down and write a story that is hopeful. It's almost impossible. There are a lot of people that don't believe in romance, and they can write a romance book because there's a certain type of writing that people look for. It's like they gazed into each other's eyes. I mean, there's vocabulary you can put in there, even if you're not a romantic person. But if you're writing a book that is supposed to be spiritually hopeful, life-giving, inspiring, it's not really something you can fake, because you can't just put in all the normal vocabulary and hope people just accept that. The story itself has to support that journey. And I've really found that a lot of times, like, the spiritual aspect of the story coincides with something that's happening. So a lot of times I'll look back at books that I've written, and I realized, like, where the plot came from was stuff that was actually happening to friends of mine or in my own life. And that's a really good way to it's almost like you're writing out a prayer. This is what you would hope for these people, you hope for yourself. And you also, it's that kind of a proclamation of faith that this is what happens. It's not always the worst case scenario. People do rise, to the best, to be the best of their ability, to be the best kind of person they are. So yeah, I would definitely think that's part of it. So let's see. I think that you guys probably talk a lot about editing, but something I've found to be really helpful when working on a deadline is to understand my part as editor. And I say that because a lot of people think they're the editor, the writer. They think that they have to catch all the typos. They have to catch every. Oh, I was just thinking, I had this scene one time, this really romantic moment. I think it was in the Cane River series, and all these gathered characters at the front of the church, and it's a wedding. And the one of the male characters they were the two main leads of this book, and the male lead at the altar as the best man gazes out at the audience and meets the eyes of the female lead as the vows. And then my editor was like, that's not, I had gotten her name wrong. And I had put the name of someone who was married to someone else. And she's like, well, plot twist. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a great catch, because that would have been so confusing to have this guy look out at his sister-in-law and be like making like loving eyes. Anyway, so yeah, we try as authors to catch every little thing, but that can be stifling as you're writing and you're trying to make sure that every name is correct, or every spelling is correct, or every scene. That's probably for the rereading. You want to make it clean when you send it in. You want to make sure that everything makes sense. But if you're spending all of your time going word by word to make sure you don't have a grammatical mistake or you don't have people in the wrong place, it's probably a good idea to make sure you have some beta readers, make sure you have an editor, line editor, people that can take that stress off you, because your role as a writer isn't so much the line editing or the content editing. Your role as the writer is to make sure the story is on the paper. And you know, somebody said, well, it sounds like you're passing the buck. Not really, because the editor is not the writer, the line editor is not the writer, your beta readers are not the writer. Everybody needs to know their role, and if the writer is trying to do all of these other roles, that makes your job so much harder. So in the beginning, I just tell myself, like, don't worry about the mistakes, don't worry about the typos, don't worry if there's some strange content issue. It's going to be caught like the second or third or fourth time I read it. And then if I don't catch it, then the beta readers will. If they don't catch it, then the editor will, because those are the people that will really free you up to do the other kind of job, or the other job, which your job is getting the story down on paper. Yeah. So I guess I have just a couple more, let's see, a couple more points here, if I can read my handwriting. Let's see. Yeah, I think the other thing is when you're writing, if people are on their first book, something other than saying, how do you imagine your book to be, not just the genre, but the length. If people say I'm stuck in the middle, I don't know what's happening, I already know what the story is doing, what the characters are doing. Sometimes I'll ask them, like, what does your reader look like to you? Sometimes those problems come from the fact that people haven't really thought about what their readership looks like. And if you're confused about what your readership looks like, sometimes in the back of your mind is, I don't want to write that, it could offend somebody, or I don't want to write that, no one will understand it. There's a book called, I think it's The Bishop's Wife, I think, by Met Harrison. Yeah, if you read that one. Anyway, and it was probably the first book that I ever read that was from within the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints religion. And it was so honest and so clear. I just thought, how did she write this without making it confusing, sounding secretive? And so after, I think I read that, I think it was 2008, it was a long time ago. And it really inspired me to, like, you know what, we can write about Catholicism and Orthodoxy in a way that's honest and clear and natural, because, millions of people live their faith. And it's okay to say you're writing this book in the spring. Of course, there's going to be Lent, there's going to be Easter. Like, why would these things not show up? You've got a story going from March to May and you don't have any Lent or Easter. It's kind of odd. So really knowing your readership and imagining them. Before I sit down, I like to think about who's the person who's reading the book. Is it somebody who is, like, I'm not going to write for somebody who's just reading science fiction. I'm not going to write for somebody who reads straight up murder mystery gore. That's not the kind of writer I am. Well, in order to know who I'm writing for, I kind of have to read in that genre. So I have to know what that person's going to feel comfortable with, but also just be true to the story, and it is, if you're just one person to another person, you're telling a story, and I just imagine them as somebody who wants to read the story and they're receptive of it. And that often kicks out the internal editor too. So anyway, I don't know if there are any questions. It kind of sounds like there's not. Is it recorded? There's not really anybody here.
Oh no, there's the people who are watching it on Facebook Live, so they're not in the Zoom, so you can't see it. But we do have a question that I was about to tell you on Facebook.
Okay.
We have a question that says, is there a specific way in which you go about making a plan for writing, or do you start with your idea and see where things lead? So how do you told us a little bit about how you go back and do a reverse outline. But I would love to hear, and the person who's asked wants to know how you plot your books.
Right. So it kind of depends. I think I've written one book that was a standalone. And all the other books were either, I think other than that, it's been, the smallest has been a 3-part, like a trilogy. The largest I think is 10. I try to aim for like 5 or 7. So it kind of depends on like the historical. I wanted that to be a 5-book series, and it turned into a 3 because my brain could not handle so much research. But so that was a 3-book series. But what I usually do is I think about how many characters I need to introduce in that first story. So in the Cane River series, I start with the male and female lead, and the female lead, she has 2 female friends, and the male lead has 4 male friends and relatives. And so I have enough there, if it's going to be a romance series, if things work out, then I have enough there to bring in a fresh character to match up with one of the other ones, or I can match up some characters that are already there. People like to be introduced to a character, and then in the next book, that character is either the lead or they're back again for maybe a different kind of role. So you never want them to be the supporting role again and again and again, unless they're just kind of a walk-on. Even then, people need to know something different about them. They don't want to hear the same description over and over. They want to know something more about their wife who died a long time ago, or their background in a certain area. So what I'll do is I'll introduce those characters in a certain way, and give a little hint, and I'll have an idea of what book 2, who's going to be in book 2, who's going to be in book 3, 4, 5. I think the Cane River series is the only book that in the last book I had written it, decided against the characters. They just, I don't know, I could not, I just didn't like them, scrapped half a book, and then decided to write the 6th book in alternating chapters of each of the previous characters. So, but what they were doing was they were talking about the current male and female lead. So you have their perspective, and then the next chapter is the first couple from the first book, kind of where they are, and you see all the other things tie in. I think that was like really kind of beyond me. I think it needed a kind of like a Stephen King ability to keep track of all the details. It was very fun to write, but I can't imagine how many content issues are in there. I tried to clean it up, but I haven't really heard any negative comments about it, but
I want to say something about that series because it's one of my favorites. I mean, I still This is why, and I don't think you give yourself credit for this. Your sense of place is amazing. Like that bookstore, I have it in my head. I have the map of it is in my head. And sometimes if I'm just tired, I can just think of it. I automatically think of it. And you did something really cool in that series. I don't know if you planned it ahead of time or if it just sort of developed. You had a sort of magic apartment.
Right.
You know, that apartment that sort of was like every time people moved into it, they wound up matchmaking. And you brought in all sorts of characters from a lot of diverse backgrounds, which is amazing. You had disabled characters. Everyone in your book, everyone was humanized. There was no disrespect of persons, and that dignity that you gave to everybody, I think somehow you convey that through the sense of place. So I wonder, that's one thing that I really like about a lot of your books too. They tend to be in places. And do you do that on purpose? Do you go through and build that first, or what comes first, the character or the place?
I would say it's probably the place, because I read a long time ago that the place is your biggest character. You think of the Martian, you know exactly where he is. Yeah, there's so many different, like a lot of people just choose some place that's cute. And people do that, especially with the Pacific Northwest and all the beautiful areas around the Puget Sound. But there's not a lot you can say about the moss and the trees, unless you're going to introduce, vampires and werewolves. Then you've got something else. But the place has really got to have a lot of history to it, unless you're going to write like speaking of Forks or Twilight, she brought a lot of Native American lore into that series. And I think that was really helpful. People said, oh, she's not a good writer, but she can tell a story. She's somebody that Stephanie Myers, if you were sitting around a campsite, she'd be the one that everybody would be listening to, because she can bring in, the lore and the stories and the, kind of string you along until you want to know the end of the story. So my college roommate was from Mississippi. And so I spent a lot of my college years going back and forth of visiting her in Mississippi. So the Jane Austen Takes the South series is set in Oxford and those surrounding areas I was really, really familiar with. And then the Louisiana area is a place that I've just really been fascinated with for a long time, because of the Creole language, which is currently, I think they call it Caribbean. That's the technical term for the language. And there are people who are very helpful when I was trying to put in the vocabulary in the books, because I knew from what I'd heard that you wouldn't want to just straight put in French, because they don't speak French. They speak Creole. And they're very proud. It's of that specific language. It's a distinct language. French people can understand Creole, and Creole people can understand French people. But it's like, someone speaking French or Italians and Spanish people can understand each other the same way. It's completely different language. So anyway, that was really useful. So I tried to find a place that had a language attached to it, which is hard in America. Because unless you're going to go for El Paso, Texas, or someplace like that. So I thought it would be really interesting to, bring in Creole. So you've got a language, and then you've got a really powerful mixed history of that area. You've got the Native Americans and the free enslaved people, and just a lot of Civil War, issues down there too. So that's really what I think about. It's usually I'm watching like National Geographic, or I'm reading something and I think, wow, how did I never know this place existed in the US? How did I not know that down in, Arizona, there's the Navajo people, there's 10,000, 15,000 speakers. How did I not know this? We currently attend a church that the languages are also Cayuse and Nez Perce. And I was like, and it was founded in 1848. And I think, how have I lived here my whole life? And I did not know that there's actually a parish here that incorporates the local indigenous languages. So I think a lot of people, when they're reading, they want to learn something different. They want to learn something true, especially about the country they live in. And it's always fun when I say, there are 750,000 hearing impaired people in Florida. There's a major school for the deaf in Florida, and people are like, "What? I never knew that." It's the things we'd never heard of. So that was fun with the Cozy Mystery series. I thought there's almost 1 million hard of hearing or the deaf community. It's a very strong community in Florida, and people come there to be close to that community. And if people don't live in that area, they're not familiar with it. They can't imagine there's a deaf university and businesses that employ all deaf workers. So I can't remember what the question was, though.
No, this is really, really helpful. I think another reason you sort of organically came to one of the other things that's been in the back of my mind recently, which is trying to tell stories that bring forward the sense of place in the United States. Because a lot of times people say, what is Christian fiction? And they go back to England or Scotland.
Right.
They can't imagine a world apart from Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who did beautiful jobs of sense of place. And yes, a lot of people here in the United States whose ancestors came from Western Europe, maybe we do want to recover some stories, but that's not our place in the world anymore.
Right.
So what does this place do? And it's really powerful the way that the church has brought people together from, like the Bible says, all tribes and nations. And so to be able to, that gives us a really special lens to look at other people who come from different backgrounds with and see their dignity, which is something that I don't feel like any other framework really exists to let us do that. And so being a faith writer and writing with a sense of place in the United States, I love how you've given us a paradigm for that. And if anyone's going to be submitting things to me, please do this. go into likewise what Mary's saying. I think we need more fiction that is not in a land that doesn't exist or in a sort of old Europe. Right. But what about here? What about those mounds in Louisiana? Where did they come from? I mean, if you want to do deep history, there have been indigenous people here for tens of thousands of years. Yeah. And we don't know a lot of the history, but, asking the question or listening, let's hear those stories, or let's just hear your story that's connected to a place. Because that's the one thing we share with indigenous people. They took care of the land where you live. And now what are you doing with it? Right. I love that. That's it. That's the connection that we need. Yeah.
I think it's interesting too about, people often, when they're outside of a community, they look at what they see as the headlines that might show up. And right now it's true, there's a lot of hurt in the indigenous community between the Catholic Church and things that have happened. There's a lot of healing that needs to happen. There's a lot of upheaval. And then when I go and enter this church full of Native Americans and also Hispanic people, it's a very mixed community, little tiny place, but it's very mixed. You see that it's a complicated issue. And I think that a lot of times as we write from the outside, we have to make sure that we're not just touching on the highlights. Like a lot of people who write about African Americans in the South, it's really difficult to find a book that has African American leads. It's not about slavery. It's not about historical fiction. It's not somebody fleeing enslavement. It's important to write all of these characters in a community that they are part of with this history, that other people are aware of that history. And so for me, the Cane River series I kept running into situations where I would think, would this character want this talked about? Would they talk about it? Would it be something that nobody would talk about? And it was so helpful to be able to reach out to people in that area. There is a national park there, and they were really helpful. They put me in touch with people who were working on reviving the Kiribati language. And all of those people had a direct, intimate knowledge of what it felt like to walk as that person in the community and be part of it with this history behind them. There was a man that I talked to for a long time. He's now passed away, but he was half Native American, half free Creole. So those were his grandparents. And he himself, he described as Creole, but he also felt very connected to both sides of that history. And in his community, a lot of people shared the same background. And so I would ask him, like, when would these topics come up? When would you? And he said, it's always in our mind. It's always, our history is always there with us. And people see the connection between church and that history is separate. And he said, but the church often was the only place where we would be safe. That was our community. Those were the holidays we had, the celebrations we had, were centered in the church. So it wasn't a separation between their culture and their church. And that was really helpful to write it and make sure that the church community was where everything came back in. But you said something about the bookstore and how everything seems so real. I just want to say, Google Street View is the best ever. So a lot of times, I did have somebody who lived there, and I would say, I'm sure they got so tired of me. I would say, if you're standing here and it's like this, and you can actually see sunset, sundown times, you can Google that and you can put in a date and see. So you don't have people, in February looking at the setting sun at 9 p.m. because that's not going to work. Even though the South has more sun, like here it gets dark at 4 right now. So yeah, it's not good. we're all feeling a little cabin fever. But anyway, so Google Street View is so helpful when you have characters. You can't have them in the same position all the time. And people don't like to read about usually people getting in the car and driving around the block. So I have the characters walking a lot. And as they're walking, I want to know where the sun is. I want to know where they're going to sit. I want to know, what tree is where. And Google Street View, you can just troll around and find, there's a beautiful place for that person to stand and look at the water. And so a lot of times people are like, wow, how much time did you spend there? I'm like, I've been to that town once, once in my whole life. It was beautiful, but I really didn't remember that much about it. But so when people are setting their story in a town, I always think it's best to, if they don't feel comfortable giving it an actual name or picking an actual town, say like Walla Walla, Washington. It's not a lot here. If people don't feel comfortable with that, I always tell them pick a town and then rename it. But everything should be from that town. Where you're walking, what you see, just add everything in there. Of course, that gets into legal issues with you don't want to be sued. But
well, you that's why you have the disclosure at the front, the disclaimer, right, trying to say everything here is fictional, etc.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other thing, go ahead. The other thing that you do is you have people come together a lot around food. And I remember there was one time where we were living in North Carolina at the time when I read one of the Cane River books, and you had everyone come together for a crawfish boil. And I grew up with those because I grew up in the Bayou country, down here by Buffalo Bayou in the Houston area. And my family would do gigantic gumbo days where we would all get together. Somebody would go crabbing and they would come back and we would sit around. My family my mom's family is Catholic, so it was a very large family, and we'd sit around picking crab meat and put it all into this gigantic pot, and we would make gumbo. And we would also do these gigantic crawfish boils or shrimp boils. And so I so related to that. And I remember I was so homesick reading that, but I totally understood how people could come together and how families could see each other and how all these relationships would be built around that. Communities do have something. They do come together around food, even if like some places it might be in North Carolina, I know they had a lot of people will do Brunswick stew. They'll make a big stew, or they'll do a pig pickin', or even funnel cakes at the fair, But I really love the way that you incorporate that. And I wonder if you think about menus whenever you're writing as well.
I do actually. And it's funny you mentioned the crawfish boil because it's on my bucket list. I've actually never been to a crawfish boil. I know. Woo! We were there was one in Portland, which is about 5 hours from us, and something happened, and it was in which actually they call it crawdads over here. I don't even think it was crawfish. Anyway, and there's a certain time of year where they can be caught in freshwater streams in a certain area, and there's a festival, and I think it was when COVID hit, and they didn't do it. And I was like, I still have not been, I still have not been to, and somebody sent me some slap your mama um like crawfish boils. I have no idea how to use it. I don't know. It's just like this bag of seasoning that I'm like, I mean, I could guess, but buying I mean, I guess I could put like shrimp in it or something. But anyway, it's just funny because a lot of the food that's in the books I've never actually eaten. Um and they just sound so delicious and I can describe them, but it's like,
yeah, I couldn't tell that you hadn't eaten that. The other thing is, if you ever want to do some research, Instagram's your friend. There are a lot of Louisiana chefs on Instagram.
Oh, yeah,
and they're just they're doing crawfish boils all the time, but they do it like, Louisiana people make stuff even spicier than Texas people. So you just got to know your level there and maybe not put as much hot sauce as everyone else, depending on what you like.
Yeah, right. I do live with a Mexican. So, I mean, there's a lot of hot stuff around here, but I am like, I'm the weeniest. I cannot. So I'll take, he'll make salsa. And I was like, oh, this is so great. And I'll take a little. I'm like,
it's very hot. Yeah. Mexican salsa is hotter than Americans think it's going to be because they're used to Americanized Tex-Mex salsa, which is like maybe one jalapeno chopped up through the whole little jar or something. It's very different. Yeah. Because of course I'm from Texas and I have Mexican American relatives as well. And I just always ask people, can you make it the gringo way for me? And they'll tease me, but I don't care. You do what you got to do.
True. It's so funny when we went down to Mexico and I would see all these little kids just eating all this hot stuff. And I see this with relatives too. It's like they just, and I think it's just an exposure thing because I can work up a tolerance, but I'm just one of those people. I like the smell of it and I think it looks great, but I will honestly cry my eyes out if I have to eat it. It's just too hot. But yeah, I think that I probably spent a ratio of 3-to-1 thinking about the food in books versus the plot because I love putting food in books and we also just love to gather around a good meal here and that's what was so great about the Cane River books was just looking at all. You said Instagram, but I would look at YouTube and you would have these people smoking. Well, that kind of gross when they do the alligator. That was a little too much, but people cooking these regional dishes, but also speaking in Creole as they did it. So, you watch a couple of those and you really get in the zone like, wow, okay, I've got it in my head what people are going to look like and where they're going to be. And yeah, that was like one of my very favorite things.
That's really cool. I'll give you a little tip. Whenever I was a little kid, the potatoes and the corn are not as hot as the rest. So the inside of the potato. So if you're a little kid who has a heat sensitivity, the corn is the least hot because it's sweet. And then the potatoes can be pretty hot, but you can take off the outside of it and the inside's not as hot. So anyway, if you ever have that problem, it's sort of like
there. Oh, that's funny.
You should do it. It's you just need a big pot, which you probably have because you have a larger family. You probably have that big pot somewhere. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for joining me. Let me just double check. Does anyone else on Facebook have any questions? You can post now. I'm looking at the comments as well. If not, I'm going to just tell you thank you. I want to just, before we close here, remind you that we've been talking with Mary Virginia Munoz, who has written over 50 books. She actually is an author who makes money like a living as an author, which is something I think is unheard of for most Orthodox writers, especially. We're just emerging this experience of being Orthodox English speaking authors is very new right now. Well, it's not new, it's recovered because Old English, we got lots of them, literally Old English though, before Chaucer and all them. But we're just now.
That's such a positive thing, being the first, that's such a positive thing. It's like with Met Harrison's book, I'd never seen anything like it. And I just think it's awesome that you have these people writing about, their actual lives and, their communities and stuff. And I think people are going to be fascinated to pick up these books and learn. Everybody wants to learn something new.
Mhm.
I think it's a very, people say, oh, everybody likes these books. They can just read like candy. Not really. I think it's a very small portion of the readership. Most people look, they pick up a book, they want to know something new, they want to learn about something. So I think that's just the perfect setting. I think you guys are going to be like right on the cusp of something.
Well, thank you so much for your encouragement. And I think it's not an easy world out there for Catholic writers either, whenever you're in the mainstream world, because you have Christian fiction is almost entirely a certain type of mega church, like not even Baptist or Methodist. It's just sort of like add some water to the evangelical movement kind of thing.
It
and
is.
so
I can read you the 1 stars I've gotten. It's hilarious. People are warning each other away. She's not really Christian, she's Catholic. And it's like, okay.
that would be a great thing to end on. This is something that I love that I feel like you taught me this, how to celebrate your first 1-star review. Could you tell me what you do? Tell the readers here, the audience, what you do when you get a 1-star review.
I'm sure everybody's gone to Amazon and looked at a book and they're like, oh, this looks great. It has 25 5 stars. A lot of people have what's called a street team, and they have those people come in and give them 5 stars. And of course they're your friends. They're not going to give you a 1 star or a 2 star. So those books, I always look at those reviews and I'm like, well, that's okay. I don't really trust those. But if I see the 25 5 stars and a 1 star, and I'm like, this book legitimately reached outside the circle. So it has some reach already. And if the 1 star is something like, I hated how in chapter 7 this character did this, but in the end they did this, I thought, you know what, you actually read it to the end. You didn't like the book. So I see that 1 star and it really lends legitimacy to your book. So I think the first time I got a 1 star, it was on Pride, Prejudice, and Cheese Grits. And I think I had like 150 5 stars. And I was so crushed by the 1 star. I was so crushed, and I didn't understand how they could possibly say my book was stupid. And that it was a long road to get to this point. But after that 1 star, sales really took off because people see that and they realize this book isn't just being propped up by friends and relatives. It's something that's actually made its way to other people. So the best thing you can possibly do is celebrate that 1 star, even that 3 star. It's painful when that's the very first review because it makes your book look terrible. But those are honest readers, and it means your book is read by somebody other than your mom or your aunt or your kids or something like that. So it's definitely something you really want to happen. Doesn't feel good at the time, but it helps your book in the long run. Yeah.
That is really good to know. So everyone, I hope you were encouraged tonight. I want to thank you so much, Mary, for joining us and teaching us. So thank you so much. And everybody, please join our Writers Workshop group. We're going to be, Parkin Books is sponsoring these webinars. And we are, this is a paid webinar, but you didn't have to pay for it. We are sponsoring and bringing in real experts who we think will encourage you. And I, as someone who is an author myself and an editor and someone who is trying to help you all, I felt very encouraged by this. So I will, since I'm the person on the camera, I'm going to just speak for everybody that this was an encouraging and helpful thing. Okay. These points, I took some notes, and I hope that everybody will go back whenever you're recording it and take some notes and really pay attention and dig into what Mary has shared with us, because she is a master of our craft. I don't know if you think of yourself that way, but I think you're a master of your craft.
I was just talking to my son who's away at college, and he was saying, I hate this paper. I know what I want to say and I can't say it. And I said, you know what? That's my whole life right now. That's my whole professional life. And you just have to come to peace to it. There's something you want to say. You can't say it exactly. You can say it close enough. And you just hope that the message comes through and that you're as truthful and honest as you can be, be as honest to your characters and honest to your readership. And I think it's awesome to be able to have this opportunity where we can have characters like us living the lives that we live, and having the same, communities and spiritual backgrounds and the same questions and struggles, and that we don't have to either water it down or sweeten it up they can just be exactly as they are. Yeah.
Yay. Well, thanks be to God. And thank you so much.